Imagine standing in the heart of a city that has become a battlefield, where every building is a fortress and every street a trap. Snow crunches underfoot. The air is thick with smoke and the metallic tang of fear. A tank rumbles past, its tracks shaking the frozen ground beneath your feet. Above, aircraft dive like hawks, their engines screaming across the sky. Every second is a fight for survival. One misstep could mean annihilation. The city doesn't sleep. It breathes tension, uncertainty, and the unyielding will of men trapped between walls of stone and steel. This was Stalingrad, winter of 1942, a city that would define the fate of nations, where strategies collided with raw human endurance, where victory and defeat were measured not just in kilometers, but in lives, courage, and the relentless ticking of the clock. Welcome, history warriors, I'm Knightley. You're about to witness history like never before. The storm is gathering on the horizon, and the calm before it is almost over. Next. War context. The year was 1942. The world was engulfed in a conflict of unimaginable scale. On the Eastern Front, the German Wehrmacht had pushed deep into Soviet territory, driven by ambition, ideology, and the desire for resources. Cities fell, rivers became front lines, and entire populations were swept up in the tides of war. Yet, in the industrial heart of the Soviet Union, a city stood like a challenge carved in stone: Stalingrad. Its name alone echoed across battlefields as a symbol of resistance. The city sat on the western bank of the Volga River, a strategic artery flowing through the heart of Russia. Controlling it meant more than winning a battle. It meant controlling supply lines, crippling Soviet industry, and striking a blow to the morale of a nation. The Germans saw it as the jewel of the Eastern Campaign, a gateway to the oil fields of the Caucasus. For the Soviets, losing Stalingrad would be unthinkable. Every building, every factory, every street became a potential front. The opposing forces could not have been more different. The German Sixth Army, experienced, methodical, and disciplined, advanced with the precision of a machine. Its commander, General Friedrich Paulus, a cautious yet competent officer, had been given strict orders from Hitler: capture the city at all costs. Supply lines were stretched, winter loomed, but the drive to conquer burned hotter than any cold. Across the Volga, the Soviets marshaled every available resource. General Vasily Chuikov, a man of grit and unwavering determination, prepared to defend the city with a mixture of cunning, tenacity, and the harsh reality of urban warfare. Stalingrad was more than a city, it was a symbol. Its factories produced tanks, trucks, and artillery. Its riverbanks carried troops and supplies. For Hitler, taking the city meant striking at the psychological and industrial heart of the Soviet Union. For Stalin, defending it meant proving that the Red Army could stand, endure, and perhaps turn the tide of the war. The larger strategic picture was equally compelling. The German advance had initially succeeded in vast, sweeping movements, encircling cities and annihilating pockets of Soviet resistance. Yet, the farther east they moved, the more tenuous the logistics became. Railways were stretched to breaking, trucks crawled over frozen roads, and the winter would soon set in, threatening to grind the mighty Wehrmacht to a halt. Stalin, ever aware of both the symbolic and practical importance of Stalingrad, was determined to hold the city at any cost, pouring men and material into its defense despite losses that would have crushed lesser commanders. On the banks of the Volga, the city's civilian population, though battered and fearful, became part of the battle. Factories turned to workshops for ammunition, buildings were fortified, rubble became barricades. The city itself seemed alive, a labyrinth of narrow streets, shattered homes, and industrial complexes. Every corner could hide an enemy. Every street could become a trap. To fight here was to fight in the bowels of the earth, in basements and attics, among walls scarred by previous fights amid smoke, ice, and fire. And the German Sixth Army approached with confidence. Months of victories had hardened them, trained them to move fast and strike hard. They carried with them a doctrine of encirclement, blitzkrieg precision, and tactical efficiency. Yet, the Soviet defense strategy was different. Chuikov understood that holding ground mattered more than maneuvering. He would trade territory for time, force for attrition, and numbers for grit. Soviet artillery and snipers were positioned to punish every advance, and reserves waited across the river to counterattack whenever opportunity arose. This was a war of attrition unlike any other. It was not enough to push forward with tanks and infantry. Every street, every building, every factory became a micro-battle. Control of a single corner could determine the fate of a neighborhood. Every day would bring a new challenge: snipers, sudden counterattacks, hidden explosives, and freezing temperatures that could halt even the most disciplined advance. The city itself was a weapon, wielded by those willing to endure. Beyond Stalingrad, the war stretched across Europe and into the deserts of North Africa. Resources were finite, reinforcements slow, and attention divided. Yet Hitler was convinced that a decisive blow in Stalingrad could demoralize the Soviets and secure the southern flank of his eastern campaign. Stalin, equally determined, saw in this city a chance to galvanize his nation and prove that no German army, no matter how disciplined, could break the spirit of the Red Army or the Soviet people. As summer bled into autumn, the city braced for the approaching storm. Streets that were once alive with industrial work now became trenches. Factories hummed with the desperate production of weapons. Smoke from distant fires mixed with the early frosts, coating everything in a grey veil. Commanders studied maps, plotted strategies, and prepared their troops for what would be one of the bloodiest confrontations in modern history. Stalingrad was a city caught between worlds, a front line for the German advance, a bastion for Soviet defense, and a symbol for both nations. Every decision mattered. Every soldier's movement counted. The stage was set, the pieces aligned. And in the icy grip of 1942, neither side could afford hesitation. The calm before chaos was almost over. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the Eastern Front, challenge the logic of generals, and redefine the limits of human endurance. Next, strategic buildup. The approach to Stalingrad was more than a march. It was a symphony of calculated risk. On the German side, every division was meticulously organized, each soldier drilled, each tank maintained to precision. General Friedrich Paulus, methodical and introspective, studied maps late into the night, calculating supply lines, urban approaches, and the location of every known factory. His mind was disciplined, his loyalty to orders unwavering, yet he carried the weight of a monumental decision: attack a city that defied easy conquest. Hitler, watching from afar, demanded speed and absolute victory. He envisioned a city falling before winter's frost, a triumph that would echo across Europe. Paulus's men advanced with the hum of diesel engines, the clatter of rifles, and the distant roar of artillery preparing to shatter the first buildings they would encounter. Logistics were stretched. Rail lines barely kept pace with the advancing columns. Supplies of ammunition, food, and medical care were critical, and any disruption could spell disaster. Across the Volga, General Vasily Chuikov prepared a defense as meticulous as any offensive plan. He was pragmatic, harsh, and unrelenting, a man who understood that the city itself was a weapon. "We shall hold every street, every house, every room," he reportedly said. Soviet troops flooded into factories and warehouses. Rubble was transformed into barricades. Snipers were stationed in the ruins, hidden from view, waiting to punish any German who thought the city could be taken easily. The German plan was precise in theory: divide the city into sectors, move methodically, suppress resistance, and push to the river's edge. But urban warfare is a different calculus. Tanks that dominated open plains struggled to maneuver among shattered buildings. Infantry could be ambushed at every corner. Streets became funnels, factories became fortresses, and every floor of every building was a potential death trap. Yet the Wehrmacht, confident in training and discipline, pushed forward, counting on speed and superior firepower to overcome the resistance. Chuikov's strategy was equally daring. He refused to retreat, forcing close-quarter engagements where German advantages in maneuver and artillery were minimized. Soviet artillery units were positioned to cover entire streets. Small, mobile teams were trained to counter tanks, using Molotov cocktails and anti-tank rifles. Snipers exploited angles that no conventional officer would consider. Every house, every floor, every cellar was part of the plan. The city itself became a weapon against the invader. On both sides, morale was tested long before the first shots. German soldiers, weary from months of advance and the harsh Russian summer, faced the reality of fighting in a labyrinth of stone, smoke, and ice. Soviet troops, though reinforced by the civilians and newly trained recruits, were expected to hold against a force considered superior in both numbers and equipment. In the freezing nights, rumors of what awaited in the streets mingled with the howling wind. Fear and resolve intertwined, forging a tension as thick as the smoke rising over the factories. Technology played a decisive role. German tanks Panzer IIIs and IVs were ready for open-field maneuver, their guns calibrated for efficiency. Artillery units, mobile and deadly, prepared to shell fortified positions with relentless precision. Aircraft circled overhead, reconnaissance planes mapping the terrain, bombers ready to carve openings in resistance lines. Yet the city neutralized many advantages. Narrow streets restricted movement, rubble slowed armor. Soviet anti-tank teams lurked in alleys, and snipers forced German troops to advance with extreme caution. Soviet innovations were subtle but effective. Trenches were dug not just in open fields, but along street corners and inside partially destroyed buildings. Barricades were hidden in rubble, often invisible until a German soldier stepped into range. The Red Army used every industrial facility for defense factories, producing ammunition while simultaneously serving as forts. Civilians, though unarmed, contributed to barricades, shelters, and logistics. Zhukov turned the urban landscape into a chessboard, where each piece, no matter how small, could tip the balance. Leadership contrasted sharply. Paulus, by nature a planner, relied on orders from above, seeking method and logic to guide his forces. He was disciplined, professional, yet the human element of war fear, improvisation, exhaustion was an unpredictable variable. Zhukov, by contrast, thrived in chaos. He encouraged initiative at lower levels, allowing junior officers to make split-second decisions that could slow or redirect the German advance. Two opposing philosophies would clash with devastating effect. Training and preparation extended to psychological readiness. Soldiers on both sides were briefed on the stakes. For the Germans, the glory of victory and the promise of strategic dominance. For the Soviets, the defense of a nation, a city, a symbol. Propaganda, orders, and speeches infused with urgency reminded troops of their purpose. Every man understood that Stalingrad would not be a brief encounter. It would be a trial of endurance, a test of wits, and a crucible of human resilience. Supply lines were a constant concern. The German advance stretched hundreds of kilometers from base depots. Every lost truck or delayed rail car could mean stalled tanks, empty ammunition depots, and exhausted soldiers. Zhukov exploited this knowledge, forcing engagements where the Germans would consume resources faster than they could be replaced. He understood that a slow attrition could be more devastating than any frontal assault. The city itself became a partner in defense. Factories were barricaded and mined. Bridges were prepared for demolition to slow enemy advances. Streets were monitored for avenues of approach. Soviet troops moved under cover, exploiting shadows, broken walls, and narrow alleys. German commanders attempted to predict movements, but the terrain confounded expectations. Every calculated plan met with improvisation and resistance. Winter, though months away, loomed as a silent ally for the defenders. German equipment, tested for the plains of Europe, was not yet adapted to urban warfare under extreme cold. Fuel would gel, engines would falter, and men would face frostbite alongside bullets. Zhukov understood that survival through autumn meant a stronger position in winter, a season that could turn momentum decisively. The human element was paramount. Soldiers trained, but fatigue, hunger, and stress added unpredictable variables. On both sides, letters from home, memories of family, and the instinct to survive shaped decisions. Commanders could plan, but the individual soldier's endurance would define the flow of battle. Every step forward risked entrapment. Every hesitation could mean being pinned down under relentless fire. By early autumn, the pieces were in place. The Germans had approached Stalingrad, surveyed the terrain, and organized divisions for attack. Soviet defenses were fortified, troops positioned in depth, and reserves ready to exploit weaknesses. Intelligence efforts probed enemy positions, seeking openings while concealing vulnerabilities. Both sides understood the magnitude of what was about to unfold. The tension was palpable. Soldiers moved with a quiet awareness that this was no ordinary engagement. Streets were scouted, buildings reinforced, snipers placed with precision. Artillery crews calculated angles and distances for maximum effect. Generals studied maps late into the night, revising strategies as new intelligence arrived. A city of 500,000 had become a battlefield where every decision mattered. Every misstep could be fatal. As the first German units neared the outskirts, scouts reported rubble-strewn avenues, fortified buildings, and signs of organized resistance. Paulus knew that victory would require more than firepower. It would require precision, coordination, and perhaps luck. Zhukov, confident yet aware of the stakes, prepared to test the limits of both men and machines, turning Stalingrad into a maze of conflict designed to trap even the most disciplined army. Winter's shadow crept closer with every day. Supply trains rattled across frozen rails, bringing fuel, food, and weapons, yet the city's defenses grew stronger with each passing hour. Soldiers dug trenches, reinforced walls, and prepared ambushes. Scouts reported every movement, every sound analyzed for potential threats. Both sides were aware that patience could be as deadly as speed. Every night the city seemed to hold its breath. Smoke rose from distant fires, winds whistled through shattered windows, and shadows shifted in ways that kept soldiers alert. The German advance, while confident, faced uncertainty in every alley. The Soviet defense, while determined, relied on courage and ingenuity to match superior firepower. The stage was set for a clash that would test strategy, technology, and the human spirit to its limits. The moment approached when the order to advance would be given. Both sides felt it, the electric tension, the crackle of anticipation, the knowledge that soon the quiet streets would erupt into chaos. Commanders double-checked positions, artillery primed, tanks ready, infantry poised. Every detail mattered. Every soldier braced for the unknown. Silence before the storm. Next, the clash. Battle begins. The first shells hit before dawn. A tremor ran through the city as explosions shattered the stillness. Windows rattled, bricks flew, and a plume of smoke rose from the factories near the Volga. German artillery, calculated and relentless, tore into the initial defensive lines. Soldiers pressed against the cold earth, clutching rifles and holding breaths that seemed too loud in the tense silence. Tanks rolled forward through narrow streets, their tracks grinding over rubble, guns trained on anything that moved. The roar of engines filled the air, mingling with the crackle of machine guns. Every intersection became a potential ambush, every building a fortress. German infantry followed closely behind, cautious but determined, advancing methodically, trying to maintain formation amidst chaos. In the shadows, Soviet snipers took positions. One by one, German officers fell, their plans disrupted by a single well-placed bullet. Smoke from destroyed vehicles and collapsing walls created a grey haze, masking the movements of small squads that darted across open streets. Zhukov had instructed his troops to blend with the ruins to vanish, then strike with precision. Flames erupted in a corner of a factory. The heat and smoke clawed at lungs, yet soldiers pressed on. Artillery fire ripped through walls, sending shards of concrete and metal spinning through the air. Civilians who had refused to evacuate huddled in basements, watching the destruction with silent terror. Above, reconnaissance aircraft circled, their observers noting every shift in troop movements, every smoke plume, every barricade. The Germans adjusted. Tanks fired into buildings suspected of hiding snipers. Infantry surged through streets, grenades tossed into doorways. Yet each advance was met with sudden resistance. A hidden Soviet squad emerged from a ruined apartment block, their rifles cutting down the vanguard before vanishing back into shadow. Coordination faltered, momentum slowed. The city fought back. Ruins became mazes, streets folded in on themselves. German commanders radioed urgent updates, but the map could not capture the unpredictability of urban warfare. Each step forward brought the risk of ambush. Each corner could conceal a hidden weapon, a sniper, or a trap. A German tank crested a small rise and was met by an anti-tank team armed with Molotov cocktails. Flames engulfed its side. The crew abandoned it. Infantry hesitated, re-evaluating their approach. Chrikov's instructions echoed in their minds. Hold every street, every building, and force them to bleed for every inch. Meanwhile, the Soviets executed counterattacks in unexpected sectors. Groups of infantry surged from alleyways, supported by machine guns from fortified positions. The Germans, caught off guard, were forced into defensive posture within their own advance. Every captured building was contested, every victory temporary. The Volga River behind Soviet lines became a lifeline. Reinforcements ferried across in small boats, bringing ammunition, troops, and hope. German forces, aware of the river's role, attempted to push deeper, yet each attempt was costly. Fires burned along the waterfront, lighting the frozen river in a crimson glow that reflected the chaos. Artillery exchanges intensified. Shells exploded against brick, concrete, and earth, turning streets into chasms of rubble. Smoke, dust, and fire combined into a murky fog that disoriented soldiers and slowed the advance. Tanks fired blindly, infantry huddled behind destroyed walls. The city had become a living enemy, reshaping itself with every volley of fire. Communication strained. Radios crackled with fragmented reports, orders delayed, coordination faltering. Paulus struggled to maintain momentum. Every tactical adjustment met with unpredictable Soviet resistance. The city refused to yield. Every intersection was a micro-battle, every rooftop a sniper's nest. By mid-morning, the Germans had taken some factories and industrial zones, but the cost was steep. Soldiers exhausted, supply trucks delayed, and morale wavering. The Soviets held key streets and intersections, exacting attrition with every firefight. Chrikov moved reserves strategically, exploiting gaps and countering advances before the Germans could consolidate. Snipers reshaped the battlefield. One German unit, advancing through a partially destroyed building, was picked off from above. Officers fell, machine gunners silenced, infantry pinned down. Each death slowed progress, sapping momentum and instilling caution among the advancing troops. Tanks continued to roar through wider avenues, but narrow streets forced them into choke points. Molotov cocktails, anti-tank rifles, and improvised explosives made every movement perilous. German soldiers adapted, but each adaptation came at a cost: delay, exposure, exhaustion. The city itself was transformed. Rubble became barricades, basements became command posts, rooftops became observation points, fires from explosions reflected off snow, creating disorienting patterns of light. Dust filled the air, coating soldiers' faces, clogging their eyes and adding an invisible opponent to the battle. In the factories, Soviet workers turned fighters continued to produce ammunition, repair weapons, and reinforce barricades. Their presence turned industrial zones into fortresses, doubling as both production centers and combat posts. German infantry, attempting to clear these areas, found themselves engaged in close-quarter fights amid machinery, conveyor belts, and smoke. Paulus realized that the city's size and complexity were undermining his strategies. Coordination broke down as small units became isolated. Streets he believed secure were suddenly contested by hidden Soviet squads. Every day cost more than he had anticipated. Every advance demanded adaptation under extreme stress. The Germans resorted to bombing runs to disrupt Soviet fortifications. Aircraft dove from the clouds, dropping payloads onto factories and streets. Fires erupted, smoke curled, and the cacophony of destruction filled the air. Yet even bombing could not break the city's defense. The Soviets had prepared fallback positions, hidden in cellars, behind walls, and in ruined buildings, ready to counterattack. The Volga continued to be a lifeline for the defenders. Reinforcements arrived under the cover of night, supplies unloaded quickly, and wounded soldiers evacuated. German forces, pressed from the north, south, and east, could not sever the river entirely. Every attempt to encircle the city faced countermeasures that prolonged the fight and exacted a heavy toll. Fires spread across blocks of residential buildings, smoke mingling with the frigid air. Civilians huddled in basements, watching the destruction with helplessness and courage intertwined. Soldiers on both sides moved with desperation, knowing that victory required sacrifice and survival demanded vigilance. The clash of tanks and infantry escalated. German armor advanced through wider avenues, while infantry cleared side streets, but each movement was contested. Soviet artillery responded with pre-calculated fire, striking both German troops and their armored vehicles. Smoke, rubble, and confusion became the dominant landscape. By the end of the first week, the Germans had seized pockets of the city, but at enormous cost. Infantry units were depleted, tanks damaged, and artillery ammunition stretched thin. Soviet defenses, though battered, held critical zones, maintaining morale and denying total control. Chuikov's strategy of flexible, layered defense had begun to show its effectiveness. The city was bleeding the invaders, slowly but steadily. Urban combat demanded adaptation. German engineers cleared rubble for movement, infantry squads engaged in close-quarter, house-to-house fights, and tanks provided fire support wherever streets widened. Yet each cleared area demanded reinforcements to hold it, slowing the pace. The city resisted methodically, every structure a new obstacle. Winter was approaching. Cold nights sapped energy, froze equipment, and added another layer of difficulty. Soldiers wrapped themselves in whatever was available, burning furniture for warmth, yet keeping fighting positions operational. The Germans were beginning to feel the strain, both physical and psychological. Soviet snipers continued to disrupt supply lines, ambush officers, and demoralize advancing troops. Every block became a potential kill zone, every abandoned building a trap. German units, trained for swift victories, now confronted an enemy who thrived in static, grueling urban warfare. The clash became a test of endurance. Day merged into night. Explosions, gunfire, and the groans of injured soldiers formed an unending rhythm. Both sides adapted. Infantry tactics shifted to tighter squads. Tanks moved with infantry covering each flank, and snipers repositioned frequently. Each micro-battle within the city had strategic significance, as no ground could be abandoned without risking collapse elsewhere. Weeks into the battle, the cityscape was unrecognizable. Streets were shredded, factories hollowed, rubble piled high, fires glowed through night, and smoke veiled daylight. German soldiers, fatigued and cautious, pressed on inch by inch. Soviet defenders, equally exhausted, used every tactic available to delay, disrupt, and wear down the advance. Commanders communicated tirelessly. Paulus attempted to coordinate sectors, order reserves, and maintain supply flow. Chuikov moved reserves into critical areas, exploiting gaps, counter-attacking lightly held zones, and forcing costly German advances. Intelligence became critical. Scouts moved through ruins, signaling movements and spotting weak points. Each day brought small victories and losses. Streets were captured, then lost again. Buildings changed hands multiple times. Tanks, artillery, and infantry engaged in an intricate dance of advance and retreat, never fully controlling the urban maze. The city had become a living battlefield. By the time winter winds swept through, the Germans had penetrated parts of the city, but had paid dearly. Supplies were low, soldiers exhausted, and morale wavering. The Soviets had held strategic positions, maintained counterattacks, and exploited terrain and knowledge of the city to maximum effect. The first clashes had set the stage for a protracted siege. Momentum was no longer one-sided. The Germans had expected a swift conquest, but the defenders had transformed Stalingrad into a fortress that refused to yield. Both sides had suffered, adapted, and learned that in this city, control was temporary, victory elusive, and survival paramount. Smoke, fire, and the cries of battle echoed across the Volga as the first phase of the clash drew to a tense pause. Soldiers rested briefly in the ruins, regrouped, and prepared for the next wave of fighting. The city had shown its teeth. The war in Stalingrad had only just begun. Next, the turning point. Winter arrived with an almost cruel swiftness. Temperatures plummeted, frosting every exposed street, every shell-pocked avenue. Vehicles refused to start, engines froze, fuel thickened like molasses in German tanks. Soldiers dug trenches, huddled around improvised fires, and braced against the wind. In the midst of exhaustion, Paulus pressed forward, convinced that Stalingrad could still be taken through attrition, yet the city was changing the rules of engagement, forcing improvisation and punishing every assumption. Soviet commanders seized the opportunity. Chuikov, familiar with the terrain and the German approach, ordered a counteroffensive in the northern sector. Units that had held quietly in basements, factories, and ruined buildings surged unexpectedly, catching isolated German units off guard. Streets that had seemed under firm German control were suddenly contested. Urban warfare had shifted from static defense to controlled, aggressive counterattacks. The first major crack in the German strategy emerged in late November. Intelligence reports, partially obscured by snow and fog, indicated Soviet forces had concentrated in areas not fully reconnoitered. Paulus had divided his forces across the city, stretching them thin to maintain pressure in multiple sectors. The Soviets exploited this dispersal, launching simultaneous attacks along the flanks. Surprise and timing were decisive. Operation Uranus, though planned long before, was now ready to unfold. Soviet generals encircled the German Sixth Army in the southern and western approaches, utilizing the harsh winter and deep knowledge of the terrain. The Germans had anticipated urban resistance, but not a strategic pincer designed to trap them. Chuikov's defense had bought enough time for reinforcements to arrive and seal exits. The encirclement was nearly complete by late November 1942. Paulus received news that shocked his command. Supplies were running dangerously low, reinforcements delayed, and the outer perimeter had been breached. "The trap is closing," he reportedly acknowledged privately. German soldiers found themselves in a city they could not fully control, surrounded by an enemy prepared to exploit every weakness. Morale began to falter. Soldiers, long accustomed to the rhythm of offensive victories, now faced freezing nights, dwindling rations, and relentless Soviet attacks. Communication breakdowns compounded the chaos. Orders took hours to reach front lines, leaving units isolated and vulnerable. Paulus, trained for meticulous coordination, found the environment increasingly uncontrollable. Soviet ingenuity manifested in every sector. Anti-tank teams positioned in previously overlooked ruins destroyed armor that had seemed invincible. Infantry ambushed supply convoys, forcing the Germans to reroute or abandon essential materials. Even small tactical victories, capturing a street, holding a building, or downing a single officer, rippled across the battlefield, demoralizing the invaders and empowering the defenders. Weather compounded the crisis. Snowstorms reduced visibility, covered tracks, and created natural obstacles. German vehicles, optimized for mobility, struggled to traverse frozen rubble. Soldiers' boots froze, fingers became numb, and frostbite emerged as a persistent threat. The Red Army, accustomed to harsh winters, leveraged conditions to increase pressure without significant exposure. Paulus attempted to maintain order. Strategic withdrawals were planned in sectors under siege, supply runs organized, and defensive positions reinforced. Yet every decision was contested by geography, enemy action, and sheer unpredictability. The city, once thought conquerable, had become an unyielding adversary. One decisive factor was the Soviet control of the flanks. Mechanized units held in reserve until this moment struck with devastating coordination. Reports from frontline officers described columns of tanks and infantry emerging from concealed positions, attacking weak points and cutting off escape routes. The German Sixth Army was surrounded, unable to maneuver freely, and forced into a defensive posture within its own advance. Winter rations, already limited, dwindled to crisis levels. Soldiers scavenged ruins, shared scant supplies, and burned wooden floors for warmth. Morale suffered not only from enemy pressure, but from the relentless environment. Chuikov's forces, supplied via the Volga and protected by the harsh terrain, maintained a steady flow of resources and reinforcement. Paulus communicated with Berlin, requesting permission to withdraw or receive air-dropped supplies. Hitler's response was clear. The Sixth Army was to hold Stalingrad at all costs. Any suggestion of retreat was dismissed. The order forced Paulus into a corner. He had to maintain positions despite dwindling capabilities and growing encirclement. Urban combat continued fiercely. Small-scale offensives, ambushes, and firefights erupted across every district. German troops struggled to clear streets and buildings while under constant pressure from snipers and artillery. Soviet soldiers, resilient and organized, forced German units to advance inch by inch, depleting both men and equipment. Every house taken demanded reinforcements to hold, slowing momentum further. The city itself became a strategic tool. Soviet commanders exploited buildings, factories, and ruins, to channel German advances into kill zones. Artillery targeted intersections where tanks and infantry converged, maximizing damage. Snipers occupied high vantage points, forcing slow, cautious movement. Zhukov's strategy transformed Stalingrad from a passive defensive position into an active trap. One of the most critical moments came when the southern pocket of the Sixth Army was cut off entirely. Communications became fragmented, supply convoys intercepted or destroyed. Soldiers found themselves trapped within a shrinking perimeter. Winter storms prevented rapid resupply, and morale deteriorated under the dual pressure of enemy action and environmental hardship. Historians later described this phase as the hour of inevitability. The German army's training, discipline, and firepower had been nullified by the combination of winter, urban resistance, and strategic encirclement. Paulus could no longer maneuver effectively, and every counterattack drained resources without achieving decisive results. On December 12th, Soviet forces consolidated control of the northern and western approaches. The city had effectively become a fortress within a trap. The German army, previously the aggressor, was now defensive, forced to respond to enemy movements rather than dictate them. Every sector contested, every street dangerous, every building a potential battleground. The psychological impact was profound. Soldiers accustomed to victory now faced the reality of isolation, dwindling supplies, and a city that refused to yield. Reports of frostbite, exhaustion, and starvation began to surface. Commanders adjusted tactics but faced the same constraint. The city and its defenders dictated the terms. Zhukov's brilliance lay in timing. The counteroffensive wasn't chaotic, it was calculated. Reserve divisions struck where the Germans were overextended. Artillery prepped positions before infantry advanced. Snipers covered flanks, and reconnaissance units fed critical intelligence to commanders. Every move reinforced the encirclement. Every advance by the Germans was met with a corresponding trap. Air support attempted to relieve pressure. German bombers flew sorties, dropping supplies and targeting Soviet positions. Snow, fog, and anti-aircraft fire limited effectiveness. Some supplies reached encircled troops, but the effort was insufficient to reverse the tide. The Sixth Army's reliance on distant logistics proved fatal. The turning point was more than tactical, it was systemic. Winter, urban warfare, encirclement, and Soviet strategy combined to create a situation the Germans could not recover from. The initiative had shifted irrevocably. Soldiers who had entered Stalingrad as aggressors were now besieged, reliant on dwindling supplies and facing a relentless opponent that exploited every weakness. Paulus faced impossible choices. Orders to hold conflicted with the reality of encirclement. Each decision risked collapse in one sector or another. Morale faltered as news of encirclement spread through the ranks. Soldiers understood that survival depended on endurance as much as skill. From the Soviet perspective, the turning point validated strategy, patience, and planning. Zhukov's instructions to hold key positions, buy time, and allow reserves to maneuver had succeeded spectacularly. The city, which had been a prize, became a weapon. Encirclement turned the German army's strength against itself, showcasing the lethal combination of terrain, timing, and tactical patience. As December deepened, the Sixth Army's fate became increasingly precarious. Food, ammunition, and medical supplies were scarce. Frostbite and disease spread among troops. Attempts to break the encirclement failed. Zhukov's forces tightened the grip, while Soviet artillery and infantry exploited every opening. The Germans were trapped, and Stalingrad had begun to define the limits of their operational capability. Historians note that the turning point was both immediate and cumulative. Individual counterattacks, winter conditions, and supply disruptions collectively shifted momentum. Tactical brilliance and environmental factors converged, producing a decisive outcome. Zhukov later remarked, "We held and the enemy tightened the noose upon itself." By late December, it was clear that the Germans could no longer dictate the battle's pace. Stalingrad was no longer a siege to win. It had become a crucible where only endurance, adaptability, and resourcefulness could survive. The initiative rested firmly with the defenders. The Sixth Army, once an unstoppable force, was now constrained within a shrinking perimeter, fighting not to advance, but to survive. Every decision, every movement, every skirmish reinforced the inevitability of the strategic shift. The turning point had been reached. Next, aftermath and consequences. The city was silent, but the silence was heavy. Stalingrad, once a bustling industrial hub, now lay in ruins. Buildings were shells of their former selves, streets were unrecognizable, and smoke still rose from pockets of fire that refused to die. The battle was over, yet the consequences stretched far beyond shattered walls and frozen rivers. For the German Sixth Army, defeat was both immediate and profound. Encircled, undersupplied, and exhausted, the remnants of the once formidable force faced surrender. General Paulus, promoted to field marshal by Hitler in a symbolic gesture to encourage resistance, capitulated in January 1943. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were taken prisoner, their hopes of victory extinguished amid the icy ruins. The Wehrmacht had lost not just men, but the illusion of invincibility that had carried it across Europe for over a year. The human cost was staggering. While numbers are debated, estimates suggest hundreds of thousands of soldiers perished or were incapacitated, wounded, or captured. Civilians, caught in the crossfire, bore the brunt of the urban destruction. Entire neighborhoods vanished beneath rubble and fire. Families fled, were trapped, or succumbed to starvation and disease. The city's population had endured months of bombardment, shortages, and relentless urban combat. Soviet forces, despite victory, had also paid dearly. Casualties were immense. Infantry units were depleted, officers lost, and replacements continually rotated in from other fronts. Artillery and armor losses were high. Yet, the morale boost was unparalleled. Stalingrad had demonstrated that determination, ingenuity, and strategic patience could overcome even the most disciplined and well-equipped adversary. Victory came at a cost, but it was decisive. Strategically, the consequences rippled across the Eastern Front. German ambitions in the south were effectively halted. The loss of Stalingrad ended the threat to the Caucasus oil fields and forced the Wehrmacht into a defensive posture across hundreds of kilometers. Operations that had been aggressive and mobile shifted into holding positions, reorganizing and recovering from losses that could never be fully replaced. The psychological impact extended beyond immediate battle lines. The myth of German invincibility, cultivated through blitzkrieg victories, was shattered. Soldiers who survived Stalingrad carried the memory of attrition, urban entrapment, and winter's cruelty. Commanders across the Eastern Front recognized the limits of operational overreach. For the Soviets, the victory was a rallying point, proving that endurance, preparation, and coordination could turn the tide against an enemy previously considered unstoppable. Stalingrad's aftermath also highlighted the human dimension of modern warfare. Soldiers on both sides had faced conditions far beyond ordinary combat. Starvation, frostbite, disease, and exhaustion became as deadly as bullets and shells. Civilians who survived the battle did so amid rubble and ruins, often lacking food, heat, or shelter. The human cost of the battle underscored that war was fought not only with tactics and firepower, but against the unforgiving elements and the limits of endurance. The city itself, though scarred, became a symbol. Its factories, once destroyed or captured, were rebuilt, its streets cleared and restored. Stalingrad stood as a testament to resilience, endurance, and the harsh realities of urban warfare. The battle would be remembered not only for the scale of destruction, but for the lessons it offered commanders, soldiers, and historians alike. On the German side, the loss reverberated through military planning. Equipment, tanks, and artillery lost in the city could not be replaced quickly. The Eastern Front required reorganization, reinforcement, and defensive posturing. Operations in the south were delayed, giving Soviet forces time to consolidate gains and prepare for counteroffensives. The Wehrmacht's momentum, so carefully cultivated through previous victories, had slowed, marking a shift in the broader trajectory of the war. Morale across the German army declined sharply. Soldiers questioned orders from high command, the feasibility of campaigns, and the prospects of survival in harsh winters and urban sieges. Propaganda could no longer mask the reality of defeat. The Sixth Army's surrender became a symbol of vulnerability, reminding the world that even elite forces could be undone by strategy, terrain, and circumstance. Soviet commanders capitalized on this momentum. Victory at Stalingrad enabled further offensives, shifting the strategic initiative firmly into Soviet hands. Chuikov's methods, flexible defense, effective use of terrain, urban attrition, and strategic patience became studied examples of effective operational art. Across the Eastern Front, Soviet forces began to exploit weaknesses in German positions, pushing westward with renewed confidence. The aftermath also demonstrated the logistical and operational limits of modern armies. Supply lines that had been stretched thin proved fatal. Urban environments nullified advantages in mobility, armor, and firepower. Winter compounded vulnerabilities. Leaders on both sides were reminded that even well-trained, disciplined forces could succumb if strategy, preparation, and environment were not fully accounted for. Cities as weapons became a critical lesson. Stalingrad showed that urban terrain could amplify defensive capabilities, transform small units into decisive forces, and slow even mechanized advances. Factories, streets, and rubble were not merely obstacles. They were instruments of strategy, amplifying the effect of determined defenders. Future operations would be studied with Stalingrad as a cautionary guide. Beyond immediate military consequences, the battle reshaped the geopolitical landscape. German plans to dominate the south of the Soviet Union were halted indefinitely. Strategic resources, including access to oil and industrial capacity, remained under Soviet control. Allied observers took note. The Eastern Front, previously dominated by German advances, now appeared contestable, with the potential for sustained Soviet offensives. Stalingrad also left enduring cultural and psychological marks. Soldiers who survived recounted months of relentless combat, fear, and endurance. Civilians who witnessed the battle carried memories of survival amidst fire and rubble. Historians would later describe Stalingrad as a defining moment of World War II, a point where determination, ingenuity, and the harsh reality of urban warfare intersected to change the course of the conflict. Casualty figures, while debated, were staggering. German losses totaled tens of thousands killed, captured, or incapacitated. Soviet forces suffered heavily but retained cohesion and strategic advantage. Civilians trapped in the crossfire experienced death, injury, starvation, and displacement. Yet amid devastation, the city endured. Reconstruction would take years, but the symbolism of survival was immediate. Stalingrad's human cost underscored the ethical dimension of modern warfare. Commanders and strategists faced the consequences of decisions that extended beyond military outcomes, touching civilians and non-combatants. Starvation, exposure, and injury were as decisive as bullets and shells. The battle became a case study in the complex interplay of strategy, morality, and human endurance. The victory also boosted Soviet morale nationally and internationally. Propaganda and communication highlighted the triumph, framing Stalingrad as a turning point where the Red Army had not only held but defeated a superior force. For soldiers on the Eastern Front, the battle became a symbol of perseverance and tactical ingenuity. For the Allies, it signaled that Germany could be checked and ultimately defeated. For Germany, the defeat prompted strategic reassessment. Winter campaigns would require preparation for harsh weather. Urban operations demanded new tactics. Commanders began recognizing the limits of overextended offensives. The loss of experienced soldiers, equipment, and morale forced a defensive posture across the Eastern Front. Stalingrad had transformed a strategic advantage into a cautionary tale of hubris and operational oversight. The long-term consequences rippled through subsequent campaigns. Soviet forces launched counteroffensives, pushing westward, reclaiming territory, and ultimately taking the strategic initiative. German forces were on the defensive, reorganizing and adapting to a new reality. The momentum shift marked the beginning of a protracted decline on the Eastern Front for Germany. Stalingrad also left a legacy in military doctrine. Urban combat, attritional defense, and the integration of environmental factors became critical considerations. Leaders analyzed the interplay of terrain, strategy, and human resilience. Factories, rivers, and rubble had become force multipliers for the defenders, challenging assumptions about mechanized and firepower superiority. The city itself, rebuilt over the years, stands as a testament to resilience. Streets once filled with rubble now bustle with life. Monuments commemorate sacrifice. The story of Stalingrad became part of the collective memory of nations, illustrating the extremes of warfare, human endurance, and strategic brilliance. As historians and strategists reflect, the battle demonstrates that no force, however disciplined, is invincible when terrain, climate, strategy, and resilience converge. Stalingrad was not just a city or a battle, it was a crucible, reshaping the Eastern Front, altering strategic momentum, and leaving lessons that echo in military study to this day. The consequences extended far beyond January 1943. Stalingrad marked the moment the tide began to turn against Germany on the Eastern Front. Momentum, morale, and strategic initiative shifted irreversibly. The war would continue, but the shadow of Stalingrad loomed over every subsequent campaign, a constant reminder that even the mightiest force could falter when overextended, surrounded, and challenged by determination and ingenuity. Next, reflection and analysis. Stalingrad is remembered not only for its destruction, but for the profound lessons it offers military strategists. The city demonstrated that urban warfare fundamentally transforms traditional tactics. Open field mobility, mechanized superiority, and firepower dominance are challenged when the battlefield is a maze of streets, rubble, and ruined buildings. Commanders must adapt to unpredictability, improvisation, and attritional conditions. Chuykov's defense exemplified this principle. His strategy was simple in concept, but brilliant in execution. Hold, buy time, and exploit the enemy's assumptions. By forcing German units into close-quarter combat and urban traps, he neutralized their advantages in armor and artillery. This approach reshaped modern understanding of urban defense, showing how preparation and patience can counter overwhelming force. Leadership under extreme conditions also stood out. Paulus, faced with encirclement and harsh winter, struggled between orders and reality. Hitler's insistence on holding Stalingrad at all costs removed operational flexibility. Here lies a timeless lesson. Strategic directives must consider on-the-ground conditions, logistics, and human endurance. Blind adherence to command can transform a capable force into a trapped and ineffective one. The role of logistics cannot be overstated. The German Sixth Army, once mobile and powerful, was crippled not only by Soviet attacks, but by supply constraints. Ammunition, food, and winter clothing were insufficient. The Soviets, in contrast, leveraged local knowledge and river transport along the Volga to maintain operational continuity. This contrast underscores a core military axiom: logistics often dictate the limits of strategy more than courage or tactics. Urban terrain amplified attrition. Each building became a mini-fortress. Every street held potential ambushes. Snipers, artillery, and improvised traps multiplied the defenders' effectiveness. In modern military doctrine, this remains critical. The environment itself can be weaponized. Stalingrad demonstrates that understanding terrain, using it strategically, and controlling choke points are as decisive as raw firepower. The battle also illustrates psychological warfare. Soldiers endured relentless bombardment, extreme cold, starvation, and isolation. Morale and resilience became as critical as combat skills. German soldiers, previously confident, faced despair as momentum shifted. Soviet forces, motivated by survival and patriotic defense, held despite casualties. Leadership must recognize the human element. Physical conditions, morale, and psychological strain directly affect operational effectiveness. Intelligence and information flow proved decisive. Soviet reconnaissance, local guides, and timely coordination allowed Chujkov to execute counterattacks precisely. German communication breakdowns, exacerbated by distance, weather, and urban complexity, led to delayed or misdirected orders. Effective intelligence gathering and rapid dissemination are pivotal, particularly in complex battlefields where visibility and mobility are restricted. Weather emerged as an unyielding factor. Winter amplified the consequences of strategic miscalculations. German equipment, optimized for mobility, struggled in sub-zero temperatures. Soldiers faced frostbite, fatigue, and impaired functionality. Chujkov leveraged this by timing counterattacks and maintaining supply lines, demonstrating how environmental mastery can shift the balance in a seemingly even fight. Attritional warfare reshaped strategy. Stalingrad was not won through a single decisive maneuver, but through persistent pressure, exploitation of weaknesses, and methodical encirclement. Both sides suffered enormous casualties, but sustained operational pressure by the Soviets eventually broke German capability. Modern military analysis emphasizes the need to anticipate prolonged engagement, particularly in complex terrain where conventional superiority may not guarantee rapid victory. The siege revealed limitations in offensive doctrine. Blitzkrieg, effective in open terrain, faltered in dense urban environments. Speed and shock require space. Cities constrain maneuver, expose flanks, and create logistical challenges. Stalingrad reminds strategists that doctrine must adapt to terrain and that over-reliance on a single operational model can lead to catastrophic failure when conditions change. Stalingrad also demonstrated the interplay of strategy and politics. Hitler's refusal to allow Paulus to retreat was a political decision with profound military consequences. Civilian considerations, political imperatives, and ideological commitment influenced operational choices, often at the expense of tactical logic. Military planners must recognize the risks of external interference when crafting strategy and maintain channels for honest reporting from commanders in the field. The battle showcased the power of initiative. Once the Soviets seized the initiative, the Germans could no longer dictate the pace. Urban terrain and encirclement magnified this effect. The lesson is clear: controlling tempo, exploiting overextension, and creating multiple pressure points can turn defensive advantage into offensive leverage. Momentum, once lost, is difficult to regain in high-intensity, attritional scenarios. Casualty management and resilience were equally significant. Soviet forces rotated units effectively, reinforced critical points, and maintained morale despite severe losses. German forces, trapped and overextended, faced cumulative fatigue, injury, and dwindling supplies. The battle highlights the interplay between operational planning and human endurance, showing that personnel management is as decisive as weaponry in prolonged engagements. Coordination across diverse forces proved crucial. Infantry, armor, artillery, and engineers had to operate seamlessly in both attack and defense. Chuikov integrated these elements with precision, allowing each to complement the others. Modern analysis emphasizes that combined arms coordination in urban environments can multiply combat effectiveness, particularly when defensive advantages exist. Stalingrad also illuminated the cost of overconfidence. German planners underestimated Soviet resilience, environmental challenges, and urban complexity. Overextension, underestimation, and failure to adapt quickly contributed directly to operational collapse. For commanders, humility, contingency planning, and situational awareness are indispensable components of successful strategy. The encirclement revealed operational vulnerabilities. By cutting off supply lines, the Soviets forced German units into defensive postures and imposed attritional pressure. This highlights a timeless strategic principle. Controlling lines of communication and supply can determine the outcome even when numerical or technological superiority exists. The lessons extend to combined operational theaters. Coordination between frontline units, reserves, logistics, and intelligence agencies allowed the Soviets to act decisively. The Germans, fragmented and reactive, could not consolidate their strengths. Modern military doctrine stresses that synergy between diverse components is essential, particularly in complex and fluid battlefields. Stalingrad also underscored the importance of flexibility. Chuikov adapted continuously, shifting troops, exploiting gaps, and using local knowledge to adjust plans dynamically. German rigidity, in contrast, made them vulnerable. Flexibility in command decisions, combined with real-time intelligence, can be decisive when conditions change unexpectedly. From a human perspective, endurance and resilience defined the battle. Soldiers and civilians alike faced extreme adversity, demonstrating that survival often depends on psychological fortitude as much as combat skill. Military leaders must recognize and plan for human limitations in strategy, logistics, and operational tempo. Technological superiority was insufficient, when environmental and human factors constrained its use. Tanks, artillery, and air power could not guarantee victory in dense urban terrain under extreme winter conditions. Stalingrad illustrates the limits of technology and the continued importance of adaptability, tactics, and strategic insight. The battle also offers lessons in timing and patience. Soviet forces delayed decisive action until conditions were optimal, allowing attrition, environmental challenges, and encirclement to weaken the enemy. Patience in strategy can convert numerical or technological parity into advantage through sustained pressure and precise timing. Leadership contrast was stark. Paulus, constrained by orders and environmental challenges, struggled to maintain cohesion. Zhukov, empowered by initiative, local knowledge, and adaptive tactics, exploited every weakness. The comparison highlights that effective leadership balances strategic vision, adaptability, and the ability to empower subordinate units to act decisively. Stalingrad's broader strategic significance cannot be understated. Its loss marked a shift in momentum on the Eastern Front. German forces transitioned from offense to defense. Soviet forces gained confidence and initiative. Operational failures at Stalingrad foreshadowed subsequent setbacks and demonstrated that tactical brilliance cannot substitute for strategic miscalculations. The battle also illustrates the ethical dimension of warfare. Civilian suffering was immense. Urban combat, starvation, and exposure affected non-combatants directly. Modern military thought must account for the humanitarian implications of strategic and tactical decisions, understanding that civilian welfare can shape both operational outcomes and post-conflict legitimacy. Stalingrad reinforced the value of preparation. Soviet forces fortified positions, maintained supply lines, and anticipated German maneuvers. German forces, relying on past success and assumptions, were unprepared for winter, urban resistance, and strategic encirclement. The lesson: preparation, intelligence, and contingency planning are as decisive as battlefield courage. From a modern military perspective, Stalingrad remains a case study in urban warfare, logistics under stress, command and control in fragmented terrain, attritional strategies, and psychological resilience. Each element, when combined, demonstrates that battlefield outcomes are rarely determined by a single factor. Success requires integration across all aspects of operations. In sum, Stalingrad offers enduring lessons: adapt tactics to terrain, value human endurance, anticipate environmental impacts, maintain operational flexibility, prioritize logistics, and integrate intelligence with decisive leadership. The battle transformed the Eastern Front, altered the trajectory of World War II, and continues to inform strategic thinking to this day. Next, epic closing. Imagine standing amidst the ruins of a city that once symbolized industrial might, now reduced to rubble, smoke curling into a frozen sky. The streets are silent, yet every stone echoes the chaos, the courage, and the tragedy of months of relentless combat. This was Stalingrad, a battlefield where human endurance met strategic brilliance and where the tide of war changed forever. We began with a question: could the German Sixth Army truly conquer a city under relentless resistance? The answer unfolded over months of fire, frost, and unyielding resolve. Stalingrad was not merely a contest of men and machines. It was a test of planning, adaptability, and willpower. Each street, factory, and ruined building became a stage where human ingenuity and determination collided with brute force. The defenders, under General Zhukov, exemplified patience and strategic mastery. By understanding terrain, exploiting urban structures, and timing their counterattacks, they turned Stalingrad itself into a weapon. Soviet forces withstood bombardment, hunger, and winter's bite, refusing to yield inch by inch, street by street. Their resilience illustrates a timeless truth: victory often belongs to those who endure, adapt, and innovate in the face of overwhelming adversity. On the other side, the German Sixth Army demonstrated discipline, courage, and tactical skill. But even the most formidable force can falter when confronted with environmental extremes, overextended supply lines, and a tenacious opponent. Paulus's dilemma, trapped by orders and circumstance, reflects the harsh reality that strategic rigidity can transform strength into vulnerability. Stalingrad's winter was more than weather. It was a decisive actor. Frozen rivers, snow-choked streets, and sub-zero nights amplified human and material limitations. Frostbite, exhaustion, and hunger became as lethal as artillery shells. Soldiers on both sides fought not just each other, but the environment itself, reminding us that nature remains an immutable factor in warfare. The battle revealed the human cost of strategic decisions. Civilians endured bombings, starvation, and displacement, while soldiers faced attrition, disease, and relentless pressure. Stalingrad was a crucible, testing endurance, resilience, and resolve. Yet, amid devastation, human ingenuity and courage shone, defining the difference between survival and surrender. Strategically, Stalingrad shifted the momentum of the Eastern Front. Germany's advance halted, the myth of invincibility shattered. Soviet forces, invigorated by their victory, began a series of counteroffensives that would carry them across hundreds of kilometers, reclaiming territory and ultimately dictating the terms of subsequent operations. The battle demonstrated that initiative, adaptability, and patience can turn even a desperate defense into a decisive advantage. The lessons of Stalingrad extend far beyond its streets. Urban warfare, logistics under extreme conditions, and leadership under duress remain studied in military academies around the world. Terrain, climate, morale, and intelligence, all these factors interact to determine outcomes as much as firepower or numbers. Commanders, strategists, and historians alike reflect on Stalingrad as a cautionary tale and a source of enduring insight. Consider the psychological dimensions. Morale, endurance, and resilience were decisive. Soldiers' capacity to continue under impossible conditions, civilians' struggle to survive amid ruin, and commanders' ability to adapt under pressure all shaped the outcome. Modern warfare studies emphasize that success is never purely mechanical. It is human, relational, and deeply contingent on the capacity to endure hardship. Stalingrad also reminds us that victories are rarely instantaneous or complete. Each day of struggle altered the strategic balance. Each counterattack, each ambush, each calculated delay mattered. The battle was cumulative, a relentless sequence of pressures that gradually exhausted the invader while empowering the defender. It was strategy manifested in patience, endurance, and foresight. Reflecting on the aftermath, we see profound consequences. The German Sixth Army's surrender reshaped Eastern Front operations, German morale, and Allied perception of the conflict. Soviet momentum increased. The myth of invincibility evaporated. Cities, armies, and nations were changed irrevocably. Stalingrad's echo would shape the course of World War II and the post-war understanding of modern combat. We also glimpse the interplay of command, environment, and human capacity. Chuikov's adaptive leadership leveraged local knowledge and timing to maximize effect. Paulus's predicament illustrates the limits of obedience and rigidity. Winter amplified weaknesses, rewarded preparation, and punished miscalculation. The battle underscores a simple truth. Success in war requires more than force. It requires foresight, flexibility, and courage under pressure. History at Stalingrad was forged in the narrow streets and frozen ruins. It was written in strategy, sweat, and sacrifice. The city itself became an instrument of warfare, proving that terrain, preparation, and patience can outweigh even the most sophisticated technologies. Lessons for today's military, historians, and strategists are clear. Understand the battlefield, anticipate environmental and human factors, and never underestimate the will to resist. As we reflect, it is impossible to ignore the human dimension. The courage displayed on both sides, the endurance of civilians, and the relentless determination of commanders provide a window into the extremes of human experience. The battle challenges us to consider the cost of strategic decisions, the resilience of societies, and the limits of human endurance. Stalingrad's legacy is both cautionary and inspirational. It warns of overreach, rigid strategy, and underestimating opponents. It inspires through the example of disciplined resistance, adaptive leadership, and the power of endurance. The city, rebuilt from ashes, now stands as a monument to these truths, reminding us that even in devastation, human ingenuity and courage endure. And so we return to the question we asked at the beginning. Could the German Sixth Army truly conquer Stalingrad? The answer lies in the ruins, in the frozen streets, and in the enduring lessons of the battle. No force, no matter how disciplined, can succeed when strategy, terrain, endurance, and adaptability converge against it. Stalingrad was a crucible, and history was the witness. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's most pivotal battles. If you've been inspired by the bravery, strategy, and resilience displayed at Stalingrad, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Share your thoughts on what stood out to you, the tactics, the endurance, or the lessons that still resonate today. Next time, Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last gamble. You won't believe what happened there. Prepare to witness a new crucible of strategy, courage, and historical drama.